Welcome to the Vermont School Board Association Online Academy. My name is Laura Soares, and today I'm going to talk about monitoring in policy governance. In policy governance, we write policies in 4 distinct areas. And if it's worth saying in policy, it's worth monitoring. So all of these policy areas are monitored by the board throughout the year. 2 of the policies are monitored by the board on the board's behavior itself: governance process and board superintendent delegation. In those cases, the board is looking at its own behavior. How are we doing as a board? Are we producing the job products that we said we would? Are we governing proactively? Are we using committees correctly? Are we staying on task and keeping to our agenda? Board superintendent delegation, we're looking at, have we truly respected the delegation that we've given to the superintendent? Have we been keeping to the monitoring schedule that we've set in that category of policies? So the board needs to look at least once a year, perhaps quarterly, and perhaps even monthly when it comes to its own meeting behavior, and create a way of checking on those policy areas. There are some handout tools that are included in this session that you can look at some potential examples of how the board can monitor itself. The other 2 quadrants that the board monitors are executive limitations and ends. In this case, it's really performing an evaluation of the superintendent by evaluating these 2 quadrants. In executive limitations, there are 3 ways that the board can monitor. The first is a direct inspection. The board can go in and take a look for itself. So if it wants to monitor asset protection and the condition of facilities, it could take a tour of the facilities and see how things are. This can be disruptive, and some boards don't have the expertise needed to monitor, certainly not all of the different policy areas. A second way that a board can monitor is an external report. This is when you hire someone from the outside to come in and do an independent evaluation. It's the most reliable, and it's also the most expensive. We do this every year with our audit of our financial books, but it may not be something that we want to do for every single policy because it would just be cost prohibitive. We can, however, use this outside source anytime that we feel that it would be useful. So what's the most common way that a board monitors executive limitation policies? It's with an internal report. This is a report from the superintendent. The superintendent signs it and certifies the accuracy of all the information in the report. The superintendent would produce a report for each policy area according to the schedule that the board has set out for itself. The superintendent would start by giving a reasonable interpretation. So what does this policy mean to the superintendent? And he or she would write their interpretation. They would then provide the data to support that interpretation and let the board know whether they were in compliance or not. Now, there will be times that superintendents will be out of compliance with certain policies. Going back to facilities, perhaps there are facility needs that are not addressed, and so the board has been out of compliance, or the district is out of compliance. The superintendent would then have to create a plan on how to get back in compliance, and the board would decide whether that was a reasonable and acceptable plan or not. If not, it would send the superintendent back to create a plan that would meet the board's needs. If it is acceptable, then the board would continue to set a monitoring schedule to follow up to ensure compliance is eventually met. Now, in the beginning in policy governance, board time is going to be spent on these monitoring reports. There'll be an ongoing dialogue with the superintendent and the board. We want our monitoring reports to have as much information in them as the board needs to be assured that the superintendent is operating within bounds. But we don't want any more information than necessary, because data, just for the sake of data, can actually distract the board from the key important items. So it's going to take some practice in policy governance to get monitoring reports that achieve that balance. Enough information, but not too much. Eventually, these reports will come to the board in its pre-packet, would get approved on a consent agenda, and would only be discussion item if the board felt that the report was incomplete or if there wasn't compliance and the board wanted to discuss it. Again, in policy governance, it would not be a board member who would make that determination, but the board as a whole. So a board member would have to make a case to the board, and the board would have to agree in majority that they want to have this discussion. The other thing to remember in monitoring executive limitations is that the board reserves the right to monitor any policy at any time by any method. So even though a schedule is established, if something comes before the board and they want more information, they absolutely have the right to do that. The final quadrant to monitor is ends. And this, of course, is our most important quadrant because this is the reason we exist as the school district. Once the board has drafted ends, it needs to spend some time talking about indicators. So how would we know if we're successful? What would convince the board that we're making reasonable progress for students achieving the ends we've set out? And the board needs to really refine that to maybe half a dozen different indicators that we're going to track over time. Test scores may be one of those indicators, although certainly not the only one. Once you have those indicators, you think, what time of year is that information available? When it comes to the NSREs, that's available once a year, so at a certain board meeting, the board would get that information. Other kinds of information the board may look at multiple times during a year. Overall, the board is looking for trends. Are we making progress? Is it reasonable progress? Are we doing better over time? If not, do we understand why not? And this would be the conversation that the board would have around ends indicators. When the board started out in policy governance, you'd want to stop and say, were these the right indicators? Are we happy with them? Are they giving us the information that we expected and that we want? But it's very important that the board spend time measuring the end results. A crude measure of the right thing is better than an exact measure of the wrong thing. So in policy governance, we need to make sure that we spend time monitoring all 4 of our policy areas: how we operate as a board, how we connect with our superintendent, whether the superintendent is staying within the limits we've established, and whether we're making reasonable progress on ends, which is student results. For more information about policy governance, please contact the Vermont School Boards Association. Thank you.